This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Greetings and welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. We are going to start with a question from Harrison, who says, what do you think of the Great Replacement theory that we are seeing a mass migration of non-white people into each and every white majority country, which will lead to the extinction of European people?
What we're seeing is yet another version of demographic anxiety. And that's a long, proud tradition in dominant in-group populations throughout history. For example, a very time-honored one is the wealthy, the well-to-do, being fearful that the poor are going to outbreed them and thus swamp and destroy their civilization. This was first cited by Thomas Malthus in 1798, and it still has a relatively recent version in the form of those supposedly highly fecund welfare queens that are going to destroy white American culture. The fear that an out group within your country is going to out reproduce you, long-standing and found all over the place. In Sri Lanka, for example, Sri Lankan Buddhists, who make up about 70% of the population, are very uptight out of the belief that Sri Lankan Muslims and Sri Lankan Hindus are soon going to out reproduce them. And this has produced the remarkable spectacle of Sri Lankan Buddhist monks being murderous leaders of crowd violence. So much for that universal image of Buddhists. Meanwhile, within the country of Russia, ethnic Russians, Slavs, are just as worried that out-group Russians, like Central Asians, are out reproducing them. This is a long-standing fear. Now, what's brought up here is one reflecting relatively recent notion of masses of people migrating from one place to another. And the particular version being cited here, this demographic anxiety, is the notion that people from all parts of the world where people are not so white are moving in massive numbers as refugees to white Europe and white America and are going to destroy pristine white culture. And I'm just going to focus on the US situation here. And the US has not been very thrilled with immigrants. Basically, as soon as the first colonists immigrated here, they started worried about dirty immigrants coming to the colonies and ruining everything. The notion of being an immigrant and the general class of immigrant was very puzzling to me when I was a kid growing up in New York. The notion that there was a monolithic category of immigrant seemed absurd because an enormous amount of attention was poured into specification, fine hair splitting of the whether you were a Sicilian Italian or a mainland Italian, or a German Jew or an Eastern European Jew, or an Irish Protestant or an Irish Catholic. And it was only when I got older and went out into parts of the real America that I realized that immigrant, there's just this generic category. A great example is there's all these actors who've spent years, John Turturro, Anthony Quinn, James Caan, each one of them playing all the usual immigrant outgroup minorities, some of them Italian and Jewish and Irish and Greek. And John Turturro, for example, who's Italian American, has played Jews in a number of movies, including being a rabbi. And he's played somebody Hispanic, an absolutely priceless 3-minute cameo in The Big Lebowski. You've got America suddenly viewing all these different subgroups as being just thems, just generic immigrants who are going to come and destroy our culture. Now, this conspiracy, this worry, this white replacement theory has sort of a light version for dieters, which is simply the notion that all of these people are going to immigrate here, parentheses, and then out reproduce us, and that's going to destroy our culture. The heavy duty conspiracy version of white replacement thinking is that all of these undesirable immigrants are coming and flooding the place, and that this is a great plot being organized behind the scenes to destroy white European and American culture. It's been planned, it's being organized. And naturally, the first people who come up from most of these conspiracists, of course, it's the Jews who are getting all these immigrant groups to flood Europe and America. They were no longer that busy poisoning the wells. So now instead, the Jewish cabal are trying to bring tons of Islamic terrorists to America. I don't quite know how that one works. It's not always focused on Jews. There's an alternative, for example, one that's been espoused by our president and vice president, some other people as well, which is there is indeed a different sort of conspiracy to bring all sorts of undesirable thems to the United States to flood the place and destroy white Christian culture. Who are the thems in this case? The Democrats who are doing this. And Tucker Carlson, of course, Elon Musk has signed on for this. As a bizarre one, Vivek Ramaswamy seems to hold that belief also, that people coming from places like his ancestral homeland are sources of trouble. But the main thing about this is a conspiracy picture. And we saw a fantastic example of that during the first Trump administration, the Charlottesville Unite the Right march that involved all sorts of neo-Nazi white Christian nationalist groups marching, carrying torches, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And I thought that was so clever and charming and elegant because they got this double entendre. Not only are we not going to be replaced by Jewish people taking our places, but we're not going to let those Jews replace all of us with those other undesirables because of that Jewish plotting. So, yeah, this one has floated around for a while. Now, what do we make of this? What do we make of the fact that simply demographically, there's a lot of immigration that has occurred in recent years in the United States? And the way to make sense of that is there's been massive amounts of immigration into the United States in points in the past, say 1880 or so to about 1915. And those folks who were showing up then are totally different outgroup members than the folks showing up now. And they were feared just as much. They were hated just as much. They were as much of a threat to white Anglo-Saxon Christian civilization as the perception is now. Irish, for example, the Irish immigrants actually starting after the Irish potato famine, but picking up in numbers after that, charmingly were referred with the N word. They are an N word who is turned inside out. Italians, meanwhile, in the American South, up until around 1950 or so, there were many parts where they were listed as non-white, a special category. The most extreme bloody lynching in American history was in the 1890s, where 11 Italian American immigrants were lynched by a massive mob in New Orleans, a mob which is such a heartwarming detail. It was biracial and also included among the murderers the future mayor of New Orleans and the future governor of Louisiana. That was the single largest lynching in American history, and this was of Italians. And of course, Jews have never been very popular at country clubs and the Ivy League for a long time. So we have a long history of real Americans being made very anxious and often murderously so by thems coming in because thems are not going to assimilate and thems are going to outnumber us. And basically, all you have to see is the thems of those terrifying immigrant waves from back then haven't really done that. And instead, we have people who are as all American as, oh, I don't know, Conan O'Brien or Steven Spielberg or Joe DiMaggio. In other words, it has worked. And the fears around 1900 turned out to be misplaced. And the crazy nationalist, jingoistic fears now will probably turn out to be misplaced also. Here's the best measure of how much individuals who used to be terrifying outgroup members are now at the very heart of American Christian nationalism. Stephen Miller, one of Trump's buddies, and he's something or other in the government. He's powerful. He played a major role in the policy of separating families when being deported. He played a major role in the attempts to ban people coming from Muslim majority countries. Apparently, even in high school, he was already doing that. There's some fascinating videos of when he was running for president in Santa Monica High School, showing that he was exactly like that then. So we've got Stephen Miller, whose grandparents emigrated were Jewish refugees from anti-Semitism in Europe and who would not be allowed in the country these days if all of the Trumpian, Millerian restrictions were put in place. That's who's doing that. Fascinating article by his uncle, a retired professor of neurology at Boston University, starting with the title that his nephew is a hypocrite, and then giving the family's history. So, I don't believe in free will, and I believe that hating somebody makes as little sense as hating a hurricane or whatever. So maybe I'll just phrase it this way. It is a very sad world that can produce somebody with this level of heartless hypocrisy.
All right, now Bernardo from Germany/Mexico says, I recently found out about the glymphatic system. Is it related to any psychiatric disorders like depression or schizophrenia?
The glymphatic system is the best. It is so interesting. It's in the brain. It was discovered in 2012 by the Danish American scientist Maken Nettegaard at University of Rochester. She and her group pioneering work showing the existence of this whole drainage system in the brain that pretty much no one had thought about looking for. And essentially what this glymphatic system does is every day at some point it hoses down your brain to get rid of all sorts of unpleasant toxic debris floating around outside your neurons. Now, how does this work? And this involves some enormously subtle research from her group and many others by now. What you have is a blood vessel in the brain, specifically an artery, and right around it is what is called the perivascular space. Vascular, blood vessel, right around perivascular space, which also involves a part of the brain that was one of my favorites in neuroanatomy for just sheer obscurity, something called the Virchow-Robin space. So you've got this fluid right around here, cuffed around there. And very close to that, you've got glial cells of a type that send out these projections very close to this artery and spit out water from their ends. From the ends close at that end, they flush water into this perivascular space. They make use of a very trendy molecule, something called an aquaporin, which is a channel in the membrane of these glial cells, which allow water to be spritzed out, and that's how that works. So what happens after these glial cells have spritzed out water to this perivascular space? Along comes a wave of blood caused by a heartbeat. Waves, pulses of blood, increased force flowing through. And what does each one of those pulses do? It sends a wave of that perivascular fluid spreading across the brain until it bumps into a vein, at which point it's absorbed and flushed out of the brain and taken to the lymphatic system. It's called the Glymphatic by Nettegaard because it's a version of the lymphatic system, but with glial cells at the heart of it. So the glymphatic system. When I was a kid, there was some amusement park in the Palisades in New Jersey that had this gigantic swimming pool that could generate an artificial wave at one end. And that's what the glymphatic system is. You've got some glial pumps right near the wave maker, and they would be spitting out water. And with the pulsing rhythm, the waves would be made and swept all the way to the other side of the pool where they'd go down the drain. And rather than entertaining summer campers, which was the purpose then, suppose the purpose was all the people who had peed in the pool or dropped stuff or sneezed or whatever, each one of these cleansing waves would clean all this toxic gunk out of the place. That's essentially what the glymphatic system is doing. One of the most interesting things about it is it's most active when you're sleeping, particularly in slow wave sleep. What you have is an expansion of the amount of extracellular fluid in your brain. More fluid, it makes it easier for that wave to wash out all sorts of crud. So, what sort of crud and with what consequences? At this point, it's very exciting that there's a strong link between problems in the glymphatic system. The wave doesn't come often enough, it doesn't come at all, it's too weak, whatever, it's not flushing out gunk, and a variety of neurological diseases. And probably the most exciting example, and this was a paper last month in Science showing Alzheimer's disease. If we've talked about, there's these two molecules where, depending on which tribe you're part of, one or the other is the cause of problems in Alzheimer's disease, beta amyloid peptides or the tau protein, but they're both floating around outside cells there and they're causing trouble. And what's shown is sleep deprivation. You don't flush out as much of this beta amyloid and tau protein outside of the brain. What that predicts is, whoa, does chronic sleep deprivation, is that a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease? Absolutely. So very solid, very interesting, very scary. But now we move to the question that was raised, what about psychiatric disorders? Is there any evidence linking abnormalities in this glymphatic system with increased risk of a psychiatric disorder? And there's definitely some hints out there by now. There's this incredibly fancy technique called diffusion tensor imaging, which is very, very complicated. It allows you to take a living person and put it in a brain scanner and, among other things, get a sense of how powerful, how frequent these glymphatic cleansing waves are. And there's now studies emerging, very recent ones, showing, for example, in major depression, you see problems, abnormalities in the glymphatic wave function, and increased severity of depression, more cognitive problems, more psychomotor fatigue, more inflammation, which is interesting since one of the things flushed out are all sorts of inflammatory messengers. So you see more of it when the flushing isn't working very well. Meanwhile, as noted in the question, there's evidence for the same happening in schizophrenia. Some interesting questions this immediately raises, and ones that we've dealt with before. Is this a problem being caused by depression or schizophrenia or any of these other diseases, or is it being caused by the medications that people take? And what's clear in all these cases, you get medication-free individuals and the problems are still there. It's not due to the meds. But this brings up the next big question, which is the easy interpretation is you got problems in the glymphatic system for whatever reason, and all sorts of toxic gunk builds up, and of toxic gunk types that increase the risk of one of these psychiatric disorders. The glymphatic problem comes first. And some of the evidence for that, for it being the preceding cause of it, is you get first episode schizophrenics, individuals who have just had their first psychotic episode. They haven't been medicated yet. They haven't been having schizophrenia for decades, and you already see the problem there. So the suggestion that the glymphatic problems come first and plausibly play some sort of role not clearing out inflammation, which definitely plays a role in a bunch of psychiatric disorders. At the same time, there's just as much reason to believe that the cart and the horse are completely reversed. And what you have instead is, once a psychiatric disease is established in the brain, among the many miserable consequences, it somehow causes abnormalities in the glymphatic system, and it's just a downstream problem. What's the evidence for that? The longer someone has had their psychiatric disorder, the more likely there are to be abnormalities in this glymphatic system. There's bits of cause, there's bits of effects, there's bits mostly showing that there's a connection between the two. So at this point, probably the best safest summary is, although nowhere near as strong of a link as with neurological diseases, the links between glymphatic abnormalities and psychiatric disorders does seem to be there.
Given that the genetics of psychiatric disorders is incredibly complicated, which we've obviously talked about before, just how messy it is, hundreds of genes implicated, etc., I'm wondering if any genes specific to the glymphatic system have been linked to any psychiatric disorders.
Yes, yes. And this was a recent paper back to those pores, those channels in the glial cells that are pumping out the water that's feeding the wave, that pore made of this protein aquaporin, and it's coded for by a gene, the aquaporin gene, and findings beginning to emerge that a subset of people with schizophrenia have weird genetic variants of the aquaporin gene. So first hints in that direction.
Well, not sure about the directionality, but might this open the way for any novel treatments like gene therapy targeting that specific aquaporin gene?
It's somewhere down the line, but it's probably safest to say that even if there is a link, this is one tiny piece of the story. So I would not expect any targeting of the glymphatic system as a psychotherapeutic approach anytime soon.
Okay, ending today, we are finally going to talk about the much requested topic that is Punch the Monkey, the macaque that has gone viral these last few months for, as Dilvan from Sweden describes, his story of being the outcast of his troop, rejected by his mother and peers, emotionally clinging to a plush monkey.
This is an epic tale, a tale of generations of heartbreak, of heroes and villains and torn bodices. And okay, so there's a mother in this who is as brutal as Dee Dee Blanchard, and there's this poor monkey being bullied, and there's this stuffy orangutan stuffy, and there's probably a plot by IKEA somewhere in here since they made the stuffy. What's the story with this? Punch, the Ichikawa City Zoo in Japan, which has a population of Japanese macaques, often known as Japanese snow monkeys, and they're wonderful. And within this group, an infant was born named Punch Kun. Kun apparently is an honorific in Japanese. So Punch Kun was this baby Japanese macaque who was rejected by his mother, pushing him away, not allowing him to cling to her. Mother brutality, abandonment, and this poor monkey who was left alone and basically had to be fed and kept alive by zookeepers who, as a comfort object, gave Punch a little plushy, stuffy orangutan, bright orange. Orangutan, just to note, is not a monkey, is an ape, but heartwarming, incredible heartwarming videos now where Punch out being bullied by the other monkeys there, Punch running back to the orang stuffy and holding onto it for comfort and dragging it behind him and never going anywhere without it. And this has been just a storm of publicity that came from this. There's been mobs of people at the zoo trying to get in, tens of millions of followers of Punch's story. There's kids now apparently saying after being bullied at school, I am Punch. IKEA showed up there and gave Punch 33 stuffies, which seems kind of puzzling, but this is just a picture of tragedy and heartbreak and outrage. What I think is one of the strangest things is the zoo refuses to give the name, the identity of the mother, presumably because she'll then be, email death threats or something, which seems like a very strange level, but nonetheless, outpouring of sympathy. This is the monkey teaching us hope and actually, probably not universal acclaim. I saw that Mu Deng gave some sort of interview in the Bangkok Times saying, Punch, Punch. I'm coming for you. I'm going to make you my little bitch. So Mujang is not happy about it, but otherwise, total source of inspiration. So now it's time for me to be a jerk and a downer and try to deflate the punch epic a little bit. First off, the mother. I feel like I'm now a public defender for the mother, telling you some of the adversity, some of the risk factors this mother has gone through. This was her first infant, no relatives in this group, so no one to be modeling in terms of child rearing. On top of it, she was low ranking, meaning she was not getting much help from anybody else. And most of all, apparently, she gave birth to Punch during a severe heat wave where she was worrying about her own survival. So, some sympathy for the mother, some mitigating circumstances. So, life without parole instead of the death penalty. What else? When you look at the video of the mother pushing punch away punches, trying to hold on and nurse for him, primatologists will immediately recognize what this is. This is mother offspring weaning conflict. As kids begin to get older, mom has had enough with this nursing and begins to push the kid away. And the kid often throws dramatic tantrums, baby baboons, when they're going through weaning conflict with their mother. It sounds like they're dying there when they're tantruming like that. And it looks just like that. And the bullying is exactly of a type you see in all sorts of old world primates where they're kind of lousy to each other. And there's very little indication that Punch, the child of a low ranking female, is being treated way worse than anybody out there. It's basic rank bullying. So, what we've got at the end here is a mom who's a tragic outcome of a no free will. And we've got a group of monkeys who are being profiled as being violent and horrible, where they're basically doing normal macaque behavior. Now, amid all of that, two bits of good news. Apparently, Punch is now slowly being integrated into the group, which is exactly what you would predict, beginning to groom with individuals, the first sort of semblances of friendships and such. And absolutely predictable with that is spending less time with the stuffy. So that's the story of Punch.
And that's all for today. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.